All right, so let's get started. So for those of you who were able to attend our last week's webinar, Nancy gave us this great overview of a trip she had planned and executed hiking the Grand Canyon. And hopefully that whetted your appetites for some high adventure, either now or in the future. And we do have a few more of those trip overviews planned for the weeks ahead. But tonight we're going to flip back over and talk a little bit more about backpacking gear, specifically shelters. And just a note on the pictures, all the pictures you'll see in the presentation came from our various outings, but we haven't labeled them. So if there's one that you're particularly interested in finding out where that took place, then just drop a note in the chat and we'll try and answer that for you. Your presenters for this webinar are all experienced campers, hikers, backpackers. Additionally, we're all instructors with the Miami Group Sierra Club Backpacking School. My name is Barry Randall, AKA Aardvark, my trail name. I've been doing this sort of thing for many, many years, and I am currently the chairperson of the Miami Group Sierra Club Outings Group. So we plan outdoor adventures, trips, including backpacking for all skill levels. And our other presenter tonight is going to be Denise. Denise, you want to introduce yourself?
Hi, my name is Denise Tingle, or really known as trail name Pippi Longstockings, because I always wear braids when I'm backpacking. I've been backpacking, camping, hiking for 45 plus years. I am the hiking chair leader for the Miami Group Sierra Club, along with an instructor for the backpacking school. Also, in addition, I lead cycling rides and backpacking trips, and my passion is backpacking, cycling, and really, truly anything in the outdoors.
Okay, and tonight we have Nancy, who's helping out with moderating, launching polls, monitoring the chat room, admitting people. So Nancy, you want to introduce yourself? We can't hear you, Nancy.
I have to unmute myself first, don't I? Sorry about that. My name is Nancy Ball. My trail name is Crunch. And I've been camping and hiking my whole life, for real. But since 2005, I've been leading backpacking trips and adventure trips to places really all over the world. This past year, I launched my new business, Planning and Leading Adventure Travel. And my company name is Summit Truck and Travel. And I'm also an instructor for the Sierra Club Backpacking School.
Okay, great. Thanks, guys. And behind the scenes, we have Nicole Wolcott, and she's not behind the scenes tonight, I guess. She wasn't able to make it, but she's been instrumental in orchestrating this virtual series, so we just always like to shout out to her. And she's actually the, volunteer coordinator for the Miami Group Sierra Club. All right. So we're going to kick it off with a poll. And so we want to know what your preferred style is when it comes to shelters, because that's going to obviously impact what kind of gear you use. So A, are you into cowboy camping? Nothing between you and the stars. B, you like your own protected space, and that means a tent. C, I want something over my head, but lightweight, so maybe a tarp or a hammock. D, trail shelter, count me in, someone who doesn't mind sharing. Or E, and other. And if you pick other, throw something in the chat for us and just let us know what your thoughts are. And oh, Nancy, you want to launch that poll?
So the poll is launched. We'll give you about maybe another 10 seconds. It looks like only a couple people are left to respond.
Oh, we got a cowboy camper. I like that. So
yeah. Okay, I think that might be all we're going to get. So I'll stop it right there and share the results with you.
Okay.
Right. So almost everyone says, give me a tent, but you got one cowboy camper out there.
Yep. Okay. And honestly, that's pretty typical. Most people, at least beginners in backpacking, and actually most people throughout their backpacking career tend to stay with tents. So I'm going to start off here by talking a little bit about sort of my personal journey through the shelter selection or the tent selection process. Everything I'm going to talk about here are fine tents. There are many, many more excellent makes and models out there. So we'll talk a little bit more about those at the end. So this is not intended to endorse any particular brand. And some of the models that I'm going to talk to you here about are older models, so I had to kind of estimate the weight or the cost of them. Excuse me. So I'm not going to go back to my really early days of Boy Scout backpacking when we were using the canvas A-frame tents. And I'm not going to talk about the car camping years, you know, young kids and a family when you got the big old Coleman tent that has, you know, 3 rooms and a big porch and all that kind of stuff. But I'm going to jump to my rejoining backpacking after our daughter joined Girl Scouts and started taking her Girl Scout troop out on backpacking trips. So at that time we had a 3-person Eureka tent. It was about 175 bucks, about 7 pounds, a little over. So, and I've given this one a yellow thumbs up because for its purpose, it's actually a fine tent. So for a youth group, for a family, it's a fine tent, but probably not something that most people who are joining this webinar are looking for a backpacking tent. Later, my daughter and I started doing some more extensive backpacking. So we were doing 100-mile section hikes of the AT, and we were doing a lot of canoe camping, going up to Boundary Waters and those kind of areas for week-long camping trips. So at that point, we went out and got a 2-person Marmot tent that you can see pictured there. A little under $200, about 5 pounds. Again, a very reasonable, nice tent. Most people would probably consider this kind of a beginner backpacking tent, given the price point and the weight. And at 5 pounds with 2 people sharing that weight, not horrible. So, you know, again, a good tent for its price point. A little later, experimented with a single wall tent, and we'll talk more about single wall versus double wall in a minute here. But this was a 2-person Eureka single wall tent. Relatively inexpensive, a little lighter than that Marmot. Not something that I particularly cared for, which is why I gave it a thumbs down. And we'll talk about that a little bit later as far as what some of the downside of single wall tents are. But that's not one that we continue to use very long. So after my daughter graduated from college and had less time to go backpacking with Dad anymore, I found myself in need of backpacking partners. So I joined the Sierra Club and started going out with that group. And that's when I invested in my 1-person Big Agnes copper spur tent. As you can see, the price jumps pretty considerably and the weight drops considerably. This is still my go-to tent for trips that are like 3 or 4 nights. So relatively short trips. I honestly love this tent. Great tent, so you know I gave it the 2 thumbs up. When I started doing longer trips, though, like the John Muir Trail, the Wonderland Trail, the Foothills Trail, the Timberline Trail, you know, mountainous, a little more aggressive. That's when I invested in a 1-person tarp tent. Tarp tent, by the way, is a brand name, but it's also kind of a class of tents that we'll talk about later, that uses using trekking poles instead of having its own independent poles. So these first 4 tents here are all versions of a 3-season freestanding or dome style tent. And that honestly is the most popular choice, particularly for people just getting into backpacking, and really just in terms of what you're going to see out on the trail. That's probably the most common thing. The last one, the tarp tent, again, is a little, sometimes it's called a hybrid between a tarp and a tent. It's a little different. We'll talk more about those later. Okay. So if there is such a thing as a typical backpacking tent, this is kind of what it would look like. So I mentioned 3-season and dome style or freestanding before. And so the 3-season stands for spring, summer, and fall. Now in the Midwest, a 3-season tent is also fine in the winter. A true 4th season or winter tent, sometimes called a mountaineering tent, is going to have sturdier construction. It's going to have less ventilation because it's intended to be in colder, used mainly in colder weather. So it has less mesh, sturdier. It's going to have more tie-down points. But again, for the Midwest, even if you're camping in the winter, it's probably really overkill. So a 3-season tent is what most people go with. Freestanding simply means that the tent body itself retains that dome shape even if there's no stakes. That doesn't mean you don't need to stake down the tent though. As we'll show later, Denise will show you later, you still need to stake down the corners and you still need to stake out the fly. But it just means that it'll retain that shape even without those stakes. To differentiate a backpacking tent from a car camping tent, it's really a matter of weight and how compact the tent will pack down. You can expect to pay from $200 to $500 for a good quality backpacking tent these days. And the weight, this is just a kind of rule of thumb guide, but the per person weight should really be under, say, 2.5 pounds. If you're considering a tent where the per person weight is above that, you might not actually be looking at a backpacking tent. Okay. Again, if there's any questions that occur to you along the way, just throw them in that chat. We're going to stop here in a minute and see if there are any questions as we go along. So let's talk a little bit about double wall versus single wall. So a double wall tent means that the fly, which is that outer solid waterproof covering, is separate from the tent body. And there's this airspace in between. And what that allows is that tent's going to breathe better, or basically just means that you're going to have better air circulation in that tent. And that in turn means that you won't get as much condensation forming on the inside of the tent. They're also a little more flexible because you can pitch that tent, just the body. So if you want, you got a nice mild night and you want to lie in your tent and look at the stars, you can just pitch that basically mesh body and just use that. It keeps away the bugs and you can see outside. And you can also just pitch the the fly. So you don't see that as often, but sometimes you can just, it becomes essentially a shaped tarp at that point with no interior body, but just the outer covering to protect you from rain. Most people, of course, pitch it with both. A single wall tent combines that fly with the tent body. So you basically have one layer of fabric with some mesh and netting built in at strategic points to vent, to give you air circulation. But there's no way around getting as much mesh or air circulation in those tents. So they tend to have more significant condensation if you're in humid weather. The Midwest tends to be somewhat humid. So that was the reason that in the end I opted to not use that Eureka single wall. It's just the condensation inside was just overwhelming. They are lighter than a double wall. They're more compact. So there are some advantages. And, if I were backpacking out in maybe like a desert, really dry kind of climate, or someplace where I did a lot of cold weather camping because there isn't as much mesh and that tends to be a little warmer, maybe I would consider a single wall, but for most of what I do anyway, it's really not a particularly good fit. Okay. Tent features. So if you're out there looking for a tent, there's going to be a number of things that you're going to want to consider. The first thing is whether it's a one person or a two person. Even if most of the time you're going to be camping and backpacking alone, some people do consider a two-person tent. Sometimes they can be quite a bit roomier and not that much more expensive and not that much heavier. So some people do opt for a two-person tent, even if most of the time they're camping alone. And that kind of leads into that second point of considering the length and the height and the volume of the tent. Particularly if you're a tall person or a big person, just make sure you can sit up comfortably in the tent. If you're lying down, your feet aren't pressed right up against the end of the tent. And the best way to do that actually is to try it in wherever you're buying it from. They usually will or should have a demo of that tent set up somewhere that you can actually lie in and try. You want to think about the number and size of the vestibules. That's those side kind of covered areas that are outside of the body of the tent, but under the fly. Is there going to be enough room for your pack? If you're camping with a partner, is there enough room for both of your packs? Another consideration is front entry versus side entry. Most people I know prefer a side entry tent. Front entry tends to take a little bit of gymnastics to get into. You kind of have to sit on your butt and spin around and get your feet going in first, because you generally have your head at the opening side. And particularly if there's two people, and particularly if there's a couple of people and it's raining or something, that can all get a little complicated and messy. So most people prefer a side entry, but there's, if a front entry works for you, that's great too. You want to take a look at the amount of mesh that the body of the tent has. You'll see some variation there. The more mesh you have, the more air circulation you'll have in that tent. But also it'll sleep a little cooler. The more mesh you have, that tends to be a little colder. Less mesh tends to be a little bit warmer. You'll want to find out if the tent comes with a footprint. The footprint is the piece of fabric or material that lies under the tent. It does some moisture management, but primarily it's there to protect the bottom of your tent from scrapes and pokes and things like that. In the picture on this slide, you can actually see the white footprint kind of sticking out from the side of the tent. That's what that is, the footprint. If your tent doesn't come with a footprint, it's not that big a deal. It's pretty easy to make one. A very popular material to make a footprint is Tyvek. If you're not familiar with Tyvek, it's actually a construction material. It goes on the outside of homes before they put the siding on. And it's a waterproof, very lightweight, very durable piece of material. That's actually what that white material is under this tent. It's a piece of Tyvek. And you can actually buy a roll of Tyvek, and you will have enough Tyvek to last you and your family and your friends and neighbors for multiple lifetimes. Or you can find somebody who's already bought a roll and get some from them. Or you can go to a construction site, which is what I do, and just do dumpster diving, try and find a piece of Tyvek. You're going to want to also consider the material of the tent. Nowadays, there are some very new materials like Dyneema, also known as Cuban fiber, that are great to reduce the weight, very durable, and extremely expensive. So they're going to drive the weight down considerably, but drive the price up considerably as well. And the last point just ties into that. You really want to think about the weight of your tent, because this is probably going to be the heaviest item in your pack. Okay. All right. So let's see. Nancy, do we have any questions yet?
We do. Quinn
Okay.
asked a really good question. She's asking, will a single wall, non-freestanding tent work for the JMT?
single wall, non-freestanding.
Yes.
So I'm assuming that means like trekking pole support. Um,
Something that's not
yeah,
going to have the, yeah.
I would think that would work. So let me back up here a minute. So this tent in this picture here is a tarp tent, which is a non-freestanding tent. So it's using trekking poles instead of a pole system, which is great, saves weight. Now this one, and in this picture, you can kind of see in the corner here that there's this body of the tent. That's actually this kind of optional mesh enclosure that comes with this particular brand of tent. So without that, I think we would have what she's describing. We would have a single wall tent that's non-freestanding. And given that the JMT, I don't think most seasons anyway, has a lot of bugs or those kinds of concerns, I would think you'd be okay with it. We'll talk a little bit more about tarps and these hybrids a little later on, and some of the implications in terms of insects and that sort of thing. So if we didn't fully answer the question and we don't answer it more fully a little bit later, ask again at the end. I don't know, Nancy, Denise, would you add anything to that?
No, I will say that particular tent for the non-freestanding, I do recall that Rick really needed a lot of room to set that particular tent up
Yep.
because it had a lot more staked out areas in order to get it like that. So
So the tent that Denise is talking about is the one on the right front of this slide. It's a Z-Pack non-freestanding, so it's not a dome tent. It uses a trekking pole in front here. And to Denise's point, it does take a pretty good footprint, not footprint as far as the actual material footprint, but footprint in terms of how much space you need to set up that tent. It's a I don't know how to describe it. It's a selfish tent. It wants a lot of room to spread out. So, but actually, that would be another great option for a JMT kind of trip.
So Barry, Quinn just added to this. She said she heard that the JMT is very rocky and hard to put down stakes, which that could be a consideration with the non-freestanding, although there are ways to work around it. With the non-freestanding, with a freestanding tent, it's a little easier for your tent to stay in shape, and you can use rocks or logs pinned between rocks or various other creative ways of getting your tent to hold its shape. But
that is a good point.
Yeah.
Yep. Yeah, I don't recall ever having any insurmountable problems with staking out a tent on the JMT, but clearly it is rocky. And Denise will talk about some creative options if you can't get a stake in the ground. But that is a good point.
Yeah. Thanks for your question, Quinn.
Okay. Anything else?
I think that's all we have. If you want to go ahead.
All right. And I think we're going to do another poll here. And we're going to start talking about tent site selection. So this poll is about what are important for a tent site selection, and level spot, not in a depression, no widowmakers. A widowmaker is a dead tree or branch above you. Free of rocks and roots, sheltered from the wind, 200 feet from the trail. So Nancy, you want to go ahead and launch that one?
It has been launched. We'll give everybody 10 or 15 seconds. And on this one, you can select as many answers as you think are correct.
Yeah, it looks like you have almost 100% on all of them.
But the safety ones are higher, so that's good. Safety first.
That is good. Almost everybody in, 90%. We have maybe one more person. Give you a couple more seconds. And I think maybe that's where we're going to end. So I'll go ahead and stop the poll now and share the results with everyone. So Most people, well, let's see here, 90% of the respondents chose the first three. 80%, I think, chose all 6 of the answers.
Yep.
Yep.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
Good. And they're all correct answers. So good job. All right. Denise, you want to take it away?
Okay. So I'm going to cover selecting a tent site. As you recall, maybe some of you joined our previous, our first one, which we talked about leave no trace, the 7 principles. Well, we're going to talk about when you select a tent site, number 2, the travel and camp on durable surfaces. So how do you select a good tent site? Note, we're not talking about the campsite. We'll cover that in a later class on planning your trips. Here we're talking about the actual spot where you'll set your tent up within the campsite. And as we begin this discussion, remember the leave no trace rule, to camp on durable surfaces. And that usually means trying to stay off the vegetation if possible. So as you can see from this slide, the tent site and orientation of your tent. The first rule would be to follow the 200-foot rule, which is you should select a site that should be about 200 feet from the water, trail, food, cook area, latrine, or privy. And this tent spot, of course, you try to be ideal and try to pick a level or on a slight rise, never in a depression. And if sloping, put your head uphill. Try not to be sideways on a hill. And the small end of your tent, not the door, should be facing the wind. This reduces the surface area caught by the wind. And of course, check for rocks, sticks. Shoot, even one of our backpacking friends even had a piece of barbed wire, believe it or not, that they found where they were going to set up their tent. And the best idea is to actually lie down on your footprint. So we all put our footprint down first and lie on it. And that really helps to select the spot, especially, you know, is your head uphill, downhill, is it level? You also want to check for ant hills. Been there, done that. Poison ivy, stickers, because you wouldn't believe stickers actually can go through the floor. Check for overhead widow makers, as we talked about those, is a dead tree or limb that could fall down in a storm. Again, lie down and look up. And that's the best way to try to get your best tent site in orientation. So once you do that, then you want to set up and start with your footprint. So, okay, you selected your perfect spot. So you start by laying out the footprint, and remember slope and wind direction as you do this. And again, you're going to lie down on it as Barry has there for us. So you set up and check your site. So again, check for any rocks or sticks, barbed wire even underneath you. Are you level or your head slightly uphill? And dead trees or branches above you? And once you've checked all these, you're ready to go. So set up, lay out the body and the poles. Lay out the tent body on top of the footprint. And many newer tents come with color-coded the corner tabs, which make it really easy to match the tent to the footprint. And also the poles sometimes are color-coded. And also the fly to the tent. And some conditions, like if it's windy out, you'll want to temporarily stake the corners while you get the poles in place. Then you unfold and line up the poles. And note that some older style tents have a cloth sleeve that the poles slide through. And most manufacturers have moved away from this design as the poles tend to get snag inside the sleeves, and that also makes it even heavier. And it's always good to set up your tent for the first time before you ever use it. So that's just a reminder. If you get a brand new tent, you want to set it up in your yard and follow these guidelines so that when you get out there, you have your tent. In addition to, before you ever go backpacking, always make sure that you always have everything that your tent needs, because you'd be surprised where people have forgotten their poles or a couple stakes, and you don't want to get out backpacking and not have your stuff. So then you set up and then you attach your body to your poles. And as you do that, you attach the poles to the tent and the footprint and the grommets, flexing the poles in the process, attach the tent body to the poles, and this is usually with clips, as you can see on Barry's tent. The setup, again, check your position and then stake the body. By having it freestanding, you can move it around too. I've done that several times after I set it up. And here's a rainy weather tip. If you're setting up camp in the rain and have a group dining tarp set up, or the tarp, you usually set that up first, or even a shelter works well. So you could assemble the tent to this point under the tarp, and then drape the fly over it and carry it to the tent site, stake it down, and you have a dry tent. And note that the stake notch points away from the tent and the stakes angle away as well. One other note, see the orange band at the bottom of the tent in the picture there? This is a continuation of the floor material, usually waterproof or highly water resistant. A floor that comes up the sides like this is known as a bathtub floor. So then you're ready to finish setting up and add the fly and stake it out. So you drape the fly over the tent body, lining up the clips to the body. Again, often these clips are color-coded to make it easier to position quickly. And note that the fly may also attach directly to the tent poles with Velcro. Or even mine has actual hooks that hook to the body of the tent to stake it out even more on the sides. And once the fly is clipped on, you stake it out, and there are usually stakes on the ends, front and back. Many tents also have additional stake down points for high winds, as shown to the small picture. These are optional in mild weather. I can't say I've used them very often, to be honest. Then you want to check the tautness in the drip line. The tent body and fly should all be taut and not sagging. Pay particular attention to the fly drip line, as you can see by the arrows in the picture. The fly should extend over the base of the tent for the best rain protection. Also check to make sure the footprint is not extending out from under the tent body, as this can catch rain and run under the tent. Can't get a stake in? This is where you can get creative. And we had to do this actually on the Timberline Trail last year. Sometimes you'll encounter rocks or roots that prevent you from getting the stake in the ground. And one way is be creative and solve this with a little rope, logs, or rocks. As you can see, Barry was using a clever little bungee cord with a hook. And then a piece of rope works fine. Add a stick and 2 big rocks and you've got a stake. And when we did the Timberline Trail, it actually was so windy, it was pulling the stakes out of the ground. So that's why we had to end up doing something like that, and it worked. Just be sure you don't lose one of them in the process of taking your tent down. So then the next thing is, when you go to take it down, you want to make sure your tent is empty. You'd be surprised how often a headlamp gets rolled up in a tent, or a sack that was supposed to put the tent in, etc. So you want to remove the fly carefully to minimize the condensation drip. And I'll often fold my flap on top of the tent to keep it off the ground. If windy, leave the corner stakes in at the 4 corners until you collapse it. The wet fly can go outside of your pack, and if placing a wet tie inside your pack, it's best to carry a spare trash bag to keep it separated. And I usually keep it also on top of either my backpack or right inside the backpack, so it's quick to get out. And don't be afraid to carry a wet tent. It will dry out quickly once you set up your next camp. Or sometimes, a lot of times, I'll set mine up when I stop for lunch. If it's a nice sunny day, I'll just droop it around the branches or something where I'm sitting, and they dry out so quick that by the time you're done with your lunch in 20-30 minutes, your tent's dry. Another thing is, do you fold or stuff it? Some people prefer to stuff their tent and fly to prevent creasing. I prefer to roll my tent so I can control the shape to fit best in my pack. And again, it's just a preference of what you like. to do and how your tent actually fits in your pack too, the best way. And then when you get home, you always thoroughly dry the tent and store loosely folded and never store it rolled tightly. I actually have a bag I got at the Dollar Tree, a laundry bag, a large laundry bag. And once my tent's dry, I just gently put it in there and it, is all loose. And then here's another rainy day tip number 2. If you're taking down your tent in the rain, most models allow you to take down the body from the inside while leaving the poles and fly up. Depending on your tent, this may require a bit of acrobatics, but it also allows you to completely pack your pack under the fly. However, I do suggest you try this at home before doing it on your trip. Another thing is when it rains, like we did for number 1, you could also take it down in the shelter by quickly just picking it up and moving it to the shelter is another way of taking it down. And just leaving the fly poles in the footprint for the outside of your pack. And it usually fits in there pretty good. Okay, do we have any questions?
Okay.
At this moment, we don't. Encourage anybody who's got something on their mind. Now's a great opportunity to type it in the chat box while we have a little break for questions.
Oh, I can just say one added thing here is I did the first time I used my tent, it was in the fall. It was a brand new tent. And I was taking my tent down and I actually lost one of the stakes because it was so the leaves were so thick that I went to get my stake out and I couldn't find it. So that was a mistake I made and I learned a lesson. Well, how about if I get some colored little lightweight twine and put it on each stake? Not only could I see it in the dark because it had the reflective rope, but also you can pull on it to get your stakes out versus trying to pull with your hand, trying to get the stakes out at times. So it really helped in both ways. But I also, when I take them out, I count them each time, believe it or not, because I don't want to ever be without a tent stake. And I always carry an extra tent stake just in case.
Good tips. I don't know.
Good tip. Okay. So still no other questions in the chat, Nancy?
No other questions.
Okay.
We can move on.
We'll keep trucking along here. So
I'll turn it over to Barry.
okay. Thank you, Denise.
Mm-hmm.
Talk a little bit here about some other shelter alternatives. We're actually going to spend more time in some later sessions on particularly the tarps and hybrids and the hammocks, but wanted to just touch on them here. And of course, for the truly adventurous, and I guess we had one on the phone, there's always this cowboy camping, and that's just laying out on the ground under the stars, which is actually a lot of fun, although I've never been brave enough to not bring a shelter with me. I usually just don't use the shelter when I do cowboy camping. So let's talk about some of the alternatives, though. Oops. Okay. So talk first about trail shelters. So these are very popular on some of the longer trails, like the Appalachian Trail, Laurel Highlands Trail, which is where that top shelter is located. The bottom one, I think, is on the AT, if I'm remembering right. So they are very convenient. They can become crowded if the weather turns bad. You may find a lot of company joining you. So if you're someone who doesn't mind spending time with some close neighbors, it can be a good alternative. It is often the home for mice and other small creatures because people do tend to cook in shelters, which tends to, of course, attract the mice and other small creatures. And if you are going to use a shelter, just familiarize yourself with some of the shelter etiquette. So one of them is that no one gets turned away from a shelter if there's room. So just because you got to the shelter first or your group got to the shelter first doesn't mean it's your shelter. It just means you got there first. So be prepared that if it's a rainy night, you may have people showing up at midnight and crawling in your shelter with you, and that's quite all right. That's proper etiquette. It surprises me how often you see this, but some people will pitch a tent inside a shelter. I understand why. You get a little more privacy, you keep your tent dry, but it is frowned upon mainly because it takes up a lot of room, right? And the whole idea of the shelter is that someone else may show up that truly needs shelter, and your tent's now taking up the space of 4 people. So try not to do that. And dogs as well. It's probably poor taste. Bring your dog into the shelter again. You don't know how many people are going to be joining you that night. Okay. Tarps and hybrids. So tarps are kind of cool, actually. There's a lot of different ways to pitch a tarp. Wayne in this picture, one of our hiking friends, has got his set up, and you can see that he's actually closed off the end of the tarp here, so it's created kind of a wall there at the end. So if you are going to do a tarp, highly recommend that you spend a little time researching the various ways to set up a tarp for different conditions. So if you're going to have some blowing wind or rain, if it's going to be hot or if it's going to be cold, there are different ways to pitch a tarp to more accommodate that particular scenario. So spend a little time, look on YouTube, see all the different ways you can set them up. It's actually kind of fun. They are very lightweight. Like I said, though, blowing rain and those kinds of things can be a bit of an issue. But if you set it up properly, it's really not. The whole fear of insects and snakes and various animals joining you at night is really more psychological than real, at least in my experience. That said, there are certainly times of the year and places where insects in particular can be totally obnoxious and can truly ruin otherwise great trips. So my personal preference is to use tarps when it's a little bit cooler weather, when the insects have died down, when I don't have to worry about those sorts of things. But, being afraid that you're going to wake up with a snake in your sleeping bag or something, I certainly never heard of it or experienced it, so I wouldn't worry too much about that sort of thing. And then last, we've talked a couple of times about these kind of hybrids where it's kind of a tarp, but they're maybe an optional netting and floor that can be used with it. Without the netting and floor, these hybrids are essentially a tarp that already has some shape to it. So it's kind of a shaped tarp. And again, usually uses trekking poles or something like that as its support system. And as I said here, they often will sell as an option a tent body, if you will, a netting and floor that can turn it into basically a double wall tent. Okay. And then there's hammocks. Hammocks are increasingly popular. A lot of people find them incredibly comfortable. They do require a tarp enclosure and what's called an underquilt to really be a 3-season shelter. An underquilt, and there's unfortunately not one in this picture, she hasn't put it up yet. The underquilt actually hangs under the hammock. So it doesn't go inside the hammock, it hangs under the hammock so that your body doesn't compress it and it retains its insulating capability. But if you're going to do any cold weather hammock camping, you really need both that underquilt and some kind of tarp enclosure. So hammocks can be a lightweight solution, but really once you get the fly and the underquilt and the suspension system and all that kind of stuff, it really starts to kind of be comparable to a lightweight tent. So most of the people I know who are really into hammocks, it's more of personal comfort. They enjoy sleeping on a hammock more so than it's a big weight gain over, again, a lightweight tent. And obviously there's little gear storage other than, you know, a headlamp and a phone and some other small items actually in the hammock. Although some of the more sophisticated ones have some kind of pockets and things. But generally speaking, what I've seen my friends do is they'll hang their pack on a tree with a pack cover over it and not try and put it anywhere in the hammock. Okay. Okay. And I don't know if any more questions have arrived, Nancy?
We have no more questions.
No more questions. Okay. In that case, we will just
So
keep
before
on.
you go on, Barry, I was just going to add a thought to the hammock thing, if that's
Go
okay.
for it.
Just because I got a hammock system last year and I finally got to use it a couple of weeks ago. We were fortunate to have 4 straight days of rain while we were backpacking. And I got to tell you, being in a hammock was way nicer because you were up off the ground and things did not get nearly as muddy, and stuff stayed drier than it did in the tent. Also, I don't have an underquilt for mine. Instead, I put a, what's it called? The closed cell foam pad, the old one. I put that inside the hammock underneath of me, which helps it hold it open a little bit, as well as provided sufficient insulation. We didn't get real cold, but it got down to about 40, maybe upper 30s, and it was adequate for that with that pad on the bottom of it. So, and I have to say, those, even though it was raining, those are the 4 most comfortable sleeping nights and out camping that I can remember in a long while. So it was way more comfortable. Altogether, the weight of what I took, actually, because I used that, the closed cell foam pad instead of my inflatable pad, I think it ended up being a couple ounces lighter than my tent, than my backpacking tent. It was really close to the same weight, and a lot more comfortable.
Yeah, great.
So I'm a new fan.
Yeah, I hadn't thought about the closed cell. I haven't seen people use that as much, but that makes sense because, you know, closed cell, your body's not going to compress it, so it's going to retain some of that insulation. So, yeah, very nice. There you go, a testimonial.
So,
Okay.
however, Daniel asked a problem question here. Is it a problem to use hammocks with long hikes like the AT? And do you, like your feet above your heart issue?
So when the hiking that I've done on the AT, I saw many, many hammocks. It didn't seem to be a problem at all. There are people that hike it every year, and that's all they ever do is hammock camping. If I do another section on the AT, I'm sure that I'll take my hammock because there are plenty of trees and all the parts of it that I've seen, at least. And in terms of feet above the heart, I did have a tendency to slide down a little bit and my feet would start to inch up, but it never felt like, I never felt like I had, blood rushing to my head or anything like that. It was still totally comfortable. But keep in mind, that's my first 4 days that I've slept in the hammock. Actually, that's not totally true. I did test that at home and slept in my backyard in a few nights, but so that hasn't been a problem. I haven't heard anybody else say that it was. I don't know if you guys heard anything related to that.
I've never heard of those issues. I mean, the obvious point is that you need trees, right? So, the AT is a very forested trail. So, the only caveat obviously would be that know the trail that you're using, because there are some, like the higher elevations of the John Muir, where there simply aren't trees. So that would be the only caveat. The AT, though, would be, I think, perfect for hammock.
And that's a great point. Part of the reason I didn't use mine until this year was because last year I was on the Colorado Trail at elevation, and I knew I couldn't count on there being trees and didn't want to figure out what to do with a hammock I couldn't hang.
Yep.
I will put a little input there, Barry, on the recall when we went to Big South Fork and two of your daughter's friends brought a hammock, and it was in the fall, and they put their hammock up, and they did look around for dead branches and stuff like you do for a regular tent. You want to make sure. However, you couldn't tell the tree was dead, and as soon as they laid in their hammock, they fell.
The tree fell over.
Part of the tree.
Oh my gosh.
Yep.
Okay.
I
Luckily
do
not
remember
on
that.
him.
I will correct you though. Those were not my daughter's friends. Those were Jay's friends.
Oh,
So
that's
Oh.
correct. That is correct.
I take no
Now,
ownership for that incident, but it is a great story.
yeah, but it is
Yeah.
something to consider though. Oh, I have another question here. Is
Oh.
there any issue with finding appropriate tree spacing?
Hmm. That's another really good question, and it's certainly it's a valid point. You do, as Barry said, you need to know the trail and know that there are plenty of trees. I didn't have any trouble on this most recent trip. I didn't really have trouble in my backyard either. We had to cut down some honeysuckle bushes that were due to go anyway. But again, on the Colorado Trail, that would have been a problem. The hammocks that I have, and I assume they're all similar, but maybe there's going to be some variance from one to the next. But I have a difference of only about 4 feet. Like I can be at like 10 feet to 14 feet apart, I think might be what the range is off the top of my head. So you do have to be confident that there are plenty of trees so that you know that you'll be able to find a selection that is the right spacing.
Yeah, I have observed that when we're camping with a group, backpacking with a group, and there are some hammock users, we actually usually defer to them to pick their spot first, because they do have a narrower selection, if you will, of places that they can put their hammock. So, there's usually, I've never been on a trip where they couldn't find a solution, but it's just that there may only be 1 or 2 really good sets of trees in a particular campsite. So we usually let them go first, and then the tent people find a spot. But I've never seen someone actually not be able to use their hammock if it's a forested area.
In case you're wondering, yes, Barry is one of the nicest people out there to backpack with. He just does kind things like that.
Okay. All right. We out of questions?
I think so.
Yes.
All right. So we've mentioned a couple of brands as we've gone along here. There's a lot of great brands out here, some that we haven't mentioned. These are a few more, but there's many others besides that. We just highly recommend that if you're in the market for a tent, visit a local outfitter like our friends at Roads, River, and Trails, who are partners in this presentation. But we really do value the experience and expertise of those kinds of organizations that can really help you with the selection process. Okay. And so our last poll, we would like to find out how we did. And the way we do that is we ask you what, if anything, you've learned that you didn't know before out of this exercise. So we're going to launch a poll here, and if you could just indicate, the number of new ideas, if any, that you heard tonight, that'll help us. If you have any specific feedback as to, things that that you particularly valued or you would have liked to heard more about, or even in upcoming sessions, we're pretty flexible in terms of the evolution of this series. So if you got a topic that you'd like to hear more on, just throw it in the chat and we'll try and consider that. While you're completing that poll, I'll mention again that we're going to post the PDF copy of the presentation on the Sierra Club website. We'll be placing the link to that, Nancy will, in the chat box here. And within a couple,
Barry.
okay, and within a couple of days, we'll be also posting a recording of this presentation. And like I said before, on that website, you're going to find a whole host of other things. Sierra Club does something we call the innings meetings, which are really educational forums on environmental issues. We have our newsletters, we have ways you can take action, all sorts of things. And if you would like to, support the efforts of the Sierra Club for not only events like this, but for the environmental protection actions that we take, Nancy will also post our donation page out there. And finally, what you'll also find out there are our outings calendar once we actually get into the outings, to get out of the pandemic and start having real outings again. And we would love to have you join us. We We really like to have new people join us. We always learn from people who join us on these outings, and it's just always a great experience. So please consider that. Okay, we're going to have a live Q&A at the end here. But before we get to that, well, I think we have one last slide. This presentation has been sponsored by, as I mentioned, Roads, Rivers, and Trails, independently owned outdoor outfitter in Milford, the Miami Group Sierra Club, and Summit Trek and Trail. And we have their contact information there. We're going to open it up here in a minute for any questions that anyone still has lingering, but if you have to take off, we certainly understand. We're kind of at the end of our time. And if you are taking off, then it's certainly been a pleasure. We hope to see you again at one of our future meetings. Thank you.